1, 2, 3. Trying to keep a balance. So I suggest introductory remark 5 minutes, and then we enter in the conversation. Bonjour. Oula.
Good afternoon to you all.
C'est au cas où quelqu'un dormirait, mais je vois que vous êtes tous
really
éveillés
loud,
et
everybody
prêts à nous
needs
écouter.
waking
On va
up.
essayer
You're
de
very
ne
much,
pas vous décevoir.
Awake and ready to listen,
Je
which
suis
will not
Philippe Lecor
disappoint you.
de
My name
Asia
is Philippe
Society
Lecor from
France.
Asia Society France.
Je suis ravi de vous
I'm
accueillir et
delighted
d'être
to
le modérateur
welcome
de
you here
cette
and to
table
moderate
ronde.
This,
Et
round
juste
table.
un mot sur Asia Society, vous n'en avez peut-être pas
a
entendu
short word
parler,
on Asia
c'est en fait un
Society, you may
réseau
not have heard of it.
de
It's a
centres
network of
sur l'Asie. Il y en a 16 dans le monde, dont un en France depuis un peu moins de 2 ans, qui organise des activités dans 3 domaines, la culture, les arts, l'éducation et ce qu'on appelle le policy, c'est-à-dire la recherche, la politique, un petit peu ce que certains d'entre nous autour de cette table font. Donc vous pouvez regarder le site de Asia Society France, vous pouvez regarder aussi toutes les Asia Society du monde, il y en a beaucoup en Asie.
At Asia Societies, there's a lot of in Asia, in Korea, in
Australie, etc.
Et
vous verrez la richesse de cette organisation. Donc nous sommes ravis cette année de faire partie du Forum pour la paix, Forum Normandie pour la paix. Alors, on va parler de l'Inde. Et je suis, ayant écouté Bertrand Badi, dont l'ombre plane au-dessus de ce forum, avec beaucoup de sympathie et de gentillesse et surtout de brio, sa théorie sur la sociologie du monde ne m'a pas échappé, dont il parlait ce matin en plénière, et je crois qu'il n'y a pas de meilleur cas que l'Inde pour évoquer l'aspect, je dirais l'aspect social, l'aspect humain des relations internationales et, disons, les différentes déclinaisons de la sociologie du monde. Alors l'Inde, il y a 3 aspects, à mon avis. Il y en a beaucoup, mais il y en a au moins 3 qu'on va essayer d'aborder aujourd'hui. Il y a d'abord l'aspect international. Il ne vous a pas échappé qu'il y a eu beaucoup de sommets ces derniers temps, cet été. Il y a toujours beaucoup de sommets, mais il y en a eu 2 qui ont été particulièrement marquants. Il y a eu le sommet des BRICS à Johannesburg, en Afrique du Sud. Et il y a eu le sommet du G20 qui s'est tenu à New Delhi, en Inde. Alors, dans un des cas, vous aviez le président chinois, et dans l'autre, il n'y avait pas le président chinois. Donc, rien que ça, c'est une information intéressante par rapport à la redistribution des cartes et par rapport au fait que vous avez quand même le BRICS qui s'est élargi, en présence notamment du président chinois. C'est un élément important. En revanche, au G20, en Inde, le président chinois, Xi Jinping, n'a pas participé. Alors, c'est peut-être un peu une mauvaise nouvelle pour le Premier ministre indien, M. Modi, mais il y a eu aussi beaucoup de bonnes nouvelles pour lui internationalement. D'abord, il est allé aux États-Unis, il est venu en France en mois de juillet. Vous avez peut-être noté qu'il était l'invité d'honneur du 14 juillet, du défilé du 14 juillet, qu'il y avait des troupes indiennes qui ont défilé, on y reviendra. Et puis, globalement, la diplomatie indienne est quelque chose dont on parle beaucoup. Alors on en parle aussi parce qu'il y a la guerre en Ukraine, parce qu'il y a les relations entre l'Inde et la Russie, notamment des achats d'armement, une relation de longue date entre l'armée indienne et en tout cas les fournisseurs d'armement russes. Et puis il y a aussi la redistribution des cartes dans ce qu'on appelle maintenant l'Indo-Pacifique, qui est en fait une région très large qui comprend l'océan Indien et l'océan Pacifique, dans lequel plusieurs acteurs jouent un rôle clé, notamment les États-Unis, qui sont une puissance du Pacifique, mais aussi l'Australie, le Japon et bien sûr l'Inde, et même la France qui a une stratégie Indo-Pacifique. Donc tout ça fait qu'il se passe énormément de choses dans cette région, sur le plan stratégique, sur le plan diplomatique, sur le plan militaire. Il y a des exercices militaires qui se font, il y a des bruits de bottes qui se font entendre régulièrement, notamment aux abords du détroit de Taïwan, également en mer de Chine. Et l'Inde n'est pas absente de ce jeu. Et je dirais même qu'il y a aussi des problèmes entre l'Inde et certains pays occidentaux, je pense en particulier au Canada, puisque vous avez peut-être suivi la crise diplomatique qui n'est pas terminée entre l'Inde et le Canada, suite à l'assassinat de M. Nijjar, un citoyen canadien de confession sikh qui a été tué le 18 juin en Colombie-Britannique, au Canada. Le deuxième aspect, c'est la politique intérieure indienne. Et il se trouve qu'on a bien choisi notre sujet parce que dans quelques mois auront lieu les élections nationales en Inde en 2024. Alors, qu'en sera-t-il de la majorité absolue du BJP, le parti de M. Modi? Quelles sont les alternatives? Il y a une coalition de 28 partis qui s'est mise en place, qui s'appelle INDIA, c'est pratique, ça m'évite d'épeler le nom des 28 partis, je ne sais pas si certains les connaissent, mais en tout cas, ces élections vont être un moment important pour faire un état des lieux de la démocratie indienne, dont certains disent qu'elle est menacée et que les droits de l'homme ne sont pas aussi respectés qu'ils ne l'étaient dans ce pays sous la gouverne de M. Modi. Le troisième aspect, j'en reviens à ce que disait Bertrand Badi, c'est la société, c'est l'économie indienne. L'Inde apparemment a bien géré l'épidémie, la sortie de crise, mais il y a des problèmes économiques, il y a une inflation, notamment dans l'alimentation, et apparemment l'image du gouvernement pâtit de ces résultats économiques décevants. Et la cote de popularité du gouvernement a également pâti de cette situation. Donc pour discuter de ça, on a trois stars autour de moi. Moi, je ne suis qu'un modeste modérateur. Et si vous le voulez bien, pour faciliter les échanges entre nous, je vais parler anglais, je vais passer à l'anglais. Et j'essaierai, alors s'il y a des questions, bien entendu, vous pourrez les poser en français, mais pour qu'on puisse discuter entre nous et ne pas passer d'une langue à l'autre, ce qui serait un petit peu compliqué. Alors ceci dit, Christophe Jaffrelot parlera français dans ses remarques préliminaires parce qu'on est en France et qu'on a la chance d'avoir un des grands experts de l'Inde en France avec nous. En France et en Europe d'ailleurs. Alors, je présente rapidement donc, en anglais les intervenants. First, Archana Chandari, welcome. You were born in Mumbai. You're a journalist. You're a financial journalist. You graduated in commerce and journalism, and you won multiple awards. And this is your first time to France, so welcome to France. Welcome to Caen. And you specialize in economics and also in societal issues, particularly women issues. So that is a topic we'd love to hear you about. And you're working on a book on the polycrisis of the Indian Himalayas, subject I also look forward to hear about. Next is Christophe Jaffrelot, who is a senior research fellow at CERI, Sciences Po Paris. He's also a professor of Indian politics and sociology at King's College, the India Institute, and he's the president of the Association of Political Science, and formerly with Carnegie in the US as well. And Christophe is involved with the Asia Society. I think you're a member of the advisory board. And his last book is Modi's India, Hindu Nationalism and the Rise of Ethnic Democracy. So you'll be our speaker on domestic politics. And last but not least, Professor Raja Mohan, who is also with the Asia Society. He's a senior fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute in India, a colleague of mine. He was the Henry Kissinger Chair in International Affairs at the US Library of Congress. He served on India's National Security Advisory Board. He led the Indian chapter of the Pungwash Conference on Science and World Affairs. He was the founding director of Carnegie India. And he writes columns for the Indian Express and previously for the Hindu. So glad to have you here, Professor Mohan. And I'll start with you, if I may, and ask you how you feel about the G20, what happened in Delhi. Was the absence of President Xi to the detriment of Modi's foreign policy? Is India's profile very high and positive at the moment after all these events and visits that I mentioned? And how do we look ahead with the elections in terms of foreign policy? Thank you.
Thank you, Philip, for inviting me. And it's really wonderful to be in this lovely setting, as well as this historic town one has heard so much about, Normandy. But I think it's a great honor to be here on the 79th anniversary of the invasion of Normandy. Before I get to the specifics of G20 and BRICS, I thought I'll say something about India as the new superpower. There is a story when Henry Kissinger, this in the 90s, when he met Deng Xiaoping, he was telling Deng Xiaoping, Chairman, China is going to be the number 2 in the world very soon. So he said, I believe Deng told Kissinger, just hold your thought there. I need another 50 years. I don't want to be number 2 just now. Because being number 2 will get its own complications. And the sense that what Deng was saying, look, to become a premature power has costs. And I think Xi Jinping has proved that dictum, absolutely right. And from our own historic experience, we saw a number of powers that showed their hand, Germany, Japan before the Second World War, and Japan again after the Second World War. You could even say Europe at one point in the 1990s, and now China. I think India has a long way to go. The sense that, that we got to be clear, while India today is the 5th largest economy at about $3.5 trillion, its per capita income still remains around $2,500. So while aggregate size gives us a lot of things, like India can run a MON program with $2,500 per capita, while Singapore with $70,000 per capita income can't do a lunar program, because size gives you the capabilities. But I think the challenge for India in the days ahead, I'm sure my colleagues here will talk about it, that how do you use the aggregate size to accelerate the prosperity of the people of India, which is, we have a long way to go there, and to strengthen India's position in the international system. So this is really a journey that has just begun. So I think to call India a superpower at this point, I think would be premature. But to come to the specific question that Philip asked, that I think as India's relative weight in the international system is continuing to grow, the fact that India is the 5th largest economy today gives it certain advantages. And the fact that its economy is also the fastest growing economy today has created conditions for making it a more important economic destination for Western capital. And third, India's growing positive relationships with the United States. This really, easy to underestimate this, because throughout the 20th century, India was at odds with the West. Today, for the first time in independent India's evolution, today we have very good relationship with the US, growing relationship with Europe, with the Anglo-Saxon countries, if you will, and Japan, which is a partner of the West. So rising economic capabilities, improving political relationships with the West, and a growing technological capacity as we look to the future technological developments in the digital and the other emerging areas. India is going to be an important contributor, and I think that's also giving India some leverage in terms of how it deals with the world. Having said that, I think what happened at G20 and BRICS, I'm a skeptic of multilateral meetings. I wonder if anybody will remember G20 next, the Delhi summit this year, after 1 year, because multilateral summits tend to be talking shops. But I think what happened at BRICS and G20 is something different. It's not President Putin could not come for either of the summits. And Xi Jinping showed up at BRICS, but did not come for G20. What we're seeing for the first time happen is the breakdown of multilateral institutions that emerged after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The WTO no longer functions. The UN Security Council has long been log-jammed. And the financial crisis of 2008, we saw the major powers come together to address the global challenge. But I think that framework in which major powers came together no longer exists because US and China are locked in an economic conflict. The terms of globalization that we thought were irreversible, uncontestable, have been challenged today. Both China and the United States are redrawing the rules of globalization. So G20 can't be what it was even just a decade ago. Therefore, the challenge in the G20 today is how do you manage the contradictions rather than producing collective solutions. And the Ukraine war in the heart of Europe has made it even more difficult to come to political understandings between the major powers. So if there was a triumph in G20 for India, it was really making sure that the summit did not collapse because of the differences over the economic issues and the political issues. There I would give some credit for the Western countries, which kind of softened their position on Ukraine in order to make sure that there was some understanding. So that is the situation on G20. On BRICS, I would say, BRICS, the expansion of BRICS, of course, a lot of people are afraid of BRICS because it's almost for the Europeans sounds like the barbarians at the gate. Or those in the West, South who think, oh my God, we're going to put together this grand coalition to defeat the West. I think both of them are wrong. Because what we saw happen in the BRICS is really an expansion. But the contradictions within the BRICS forum, between India and China in particular, are so deep today that the idea that this is going to be a coherent organization would be fundamentally mistaken. You can put together a sack of potatoes, but you're not going to ram a fort with a sack of potatoes. So the more numbers does not make BRICS any more powerful. And BRICS itself becomes a theater for contestation between different groups. Between Russia and China, which want to make it an anti-Western grouping, and India that wants to temper its anti-Western moorings that they want to make. So I think BRICS is going to be even a bigger talking shop than it was before. So I wouldn't put too much on it. What we're seeing happen in the multilateral domain, let me say this finally on BRICS. We are now being compared to Britain and the EU. We're like the poison pill in the BRICS, which limits the damage, because what Britain did in the European Union to limit it from becoming too much of a coherent anti-American or transatlantic force. So my sense is that we're going to see more like-minded coalitions, like the Quad, like the AUKUS, the resilient supply chains, which means countries coming together to move the supply chains, coming together to produce new coalitions on production of technology. In all these, which are India plus the West, or China plus one, whichever way you want to frame it, we're going to see a larger role for India. So I'm going to say in the days ahead, we're going to see more like-minded coalitions that are going to be the ones that are going to produce multilateral outcomes rather than the all-in-one United Nations, all-in-one WTO, all-in-one ASEAN. So these institutions are in a crisis, and what you're going to see are new coalitions between countries like India, Japan, and the West. Those are going to come up with new rules. And I think that is a fundamental shift, both in the way the world is going to be organized, the way India is going to deal with the world. And I think that's one of the consequences of India's rise.
Thank you very much. So I want to come back to you, but maybe later on Modi's foreign policy. But let's switch to Christophe. Et je parle français puisque Christophe va parler français quand même.
Switching to French because Christophe will be
Christophe,
French.
est-ce que tu as une réaction par rapport à ce que vient de dire notre ami Raja Mohan sur la politique de Modi en Inde? Et comment est-ce que tu vois cet agenda électoral qui se dessine en Inde dans les mois qui viennent?
Oui, je vais commencer par réagir à ce que disait Raja parce que je trouve très intéressant son analyse et on peut la connecter ensuite à la politique intérieure. Donc un plan en deux parties comme on les aime à Sciences Po. Dans la première partie, effectivement, en termes de politique internationale, je suis tout à fait d'accord pour dire que les deux sommets qui se sont succédés, le sommet des BRICS et puis le sommet du G20, forment une séquence. Et forment une séquence qui peut-être dans quelques années sera vue comme un tournant. Un tournant au sens où, quand la Chine réussit à tordre le bras du Brésil et de l'Inde pour ajouter 6 pays aux BRICS, qui doivent s'appeler autrement maintenant, eh bien, elle réussit d'abord un coup de force par rapport à deux piliers du groupe initial, et deuxièmement, à dire j'ai ma propre coalition internationale. On assiste à un dédoublement de la scène internationale. Et c'est confirmé par le fait que Xi Jinping ne vient pas au G20. C'est plus la peine. C'est plus là que ça se passe. J'ai mon propre instrument d'influence sur le Sud global, parce que le Sud global, c'est bien sûr l'enjeu. Et dans les nouveaux venus du BRICS+, il n'y a que des gens du Sud. Alors, ça pourra être un tournant un jour prochain, si on se rend compte que ça a été le moment où on a vu la bipolarisation du monde redevenir la norme. On a aujourd'hui l'idée d'un monde multipolaire. Le monde est de moins en moins multipolaire. On a deux coalitions qui sont de plus en plus structurées autour de deux grands pays qui sont en rivalité. Et cela me ramène à l'Inde, bien sûr, parce qu'un monde qui n'est pas multipolaire, c'est précisément ce que l'Inde veut éviter. Le plurilatéralisme, ce que Jay Shankar, dans son livre Les Indian Way, appelle le plurilatéralisme, c'est cette capacité à faire des accords, jamais des alliances, mais des accords ponctuels, des partenariats ciblés avec toutes sortes de pays qui ne se parlent pas entre eux, mais avec lesquels on va parler nous. Dès lors que le monde se retrouve structuré autour de deux coalitions, ça n'est plus possible. Ça n'est plus aussi facile. Et du coup, la question qui se pose, c'est jusqu'où est-ce qu'il est tenable de ne pas prendre parti? Jusqu'où est-ce que l'Inde peut rester équidistante de pays aussi maintenant rivaux que la Chine et les États-Unis? C'est son agenda. Elle cherche à rester multi-alignée ou plurilatérale, comme vous voulez. La bipolarisation croissante d'un côté, l'agressivité chinoise de l'autre, qui prend des positions dans l'Himalaya, qui encercle l'Inde en mettant la main sur des pays comme Sri Lanka, et troisièmement, qui met l'Inde dans une situation économique très difficile parce qu'elle a une telle avance que l'Inde est sur la défensive. Tout ça m'amène à me demander si un jour prochain, l'Inde ne sera pas obligée de choisir son camp, en quelque sorte. Et là, si c'est le cas, on regardera 2023 comme un moment de bascule. Politique intérieure maintenant, en quelques mots. J'utilise des formules qui permettent la comparaison et du coup qui permettent de mieux voir, j'espère, ce que la dynamique de la politique intérieure indienne représente aujourd'hui. National-populisme, démocratie ethnique, autoritarisme électoral. À nouveau, ça forme un ensemble, ça forme une séquence. Et ça vous évoque tout de suite des points de comparaison, ça vous aide à comprendre où se situe l'Inde à l'échelle internationale. Le populisme est devenu, dans les années 2010-2020, le répertoire d'action politique le plus réussi, celui qui a remporté le plus de succès. Combien de présidents se sont fait élire ainsi, de Erdogan à Bolsonaro, en passant par, bien sûr, Orban, Netanyahou. La liste est très longue. Le populisme, c'est toujours la même chose. C'est un homme providentiel, un homme fort, qui rentre en relation directe avec son peuple et qui réussit à le mobiliser lors de campagnes électorales autour d'émotions fortes. Ça, c'est le populisme de gauche comme de droite, parce que j'ai cité que des leaders de droite, mais on pourrait trouver des populistes de gauche. Ce sont des gens de gauche qui ont inventé le populisme. Perón, en Argentine, dans les années d'après-guerre, le populisme est né à gauche. Mais le national-populisme, c'est la version de droite. Le peuple que défend l'homme providentiel dans le cas du national-populisme, ça n'est pas tous les citoyens. C'est le groupe ethno-religieux ou ethno-linguistique majoritaire. Netanyahou ne défend que les juifs, bien sûr. Orban lutte contre les migrants. Erdogan s'en prend aux Kurdes. La liste est toujours aussi longue. À chaque fois, le national-populiste défend les fils du sol. Et en Inde, Narendra Modi est d'abord le porte-parole de la majorité hindoue. Et d'ailleurs, on parle de majoritarisme. Vous pouvez absolument traduire national-populisme par majoritarisme. Ça fait pratiquement la même chose. Ça donne, deuxième séquence, une fois qu'il est élu, une démocratie ethnique. Et le mot, là encore, vient d'ailleurs. La notion de démocratie ethnique est née en Israël pour définir ce qu'est Israël. Une démocratie, bien sûr. On vote. La liberté de la presse est relativement reconnue. La justice est relativement indépendante. C'est d'ailleurs pourquoi Netanyahou s'y attaque autant en ce moment. Il y a une démocratie, oui, mais pas pour tout le monde. Il y a des citoyens de seconde zone. Et on sait très bien que les citoyens arabes en Israël n'ont pas les mêmes droits que les citoyens juifs. Eh bien, on a ce modèle qui est en train de prendre corps en Inde. Peu à peu, les musulmans, voire les chrétiens, deviennent citoyens de seconde zone. Ils ne sont plus représentés dans le groupe parlementaire majoritaire à la Chambre basse, zéro. Ils n'ont pas non plus de porte-parole dans la plupart des institutions de l'Inde actuelle. Et on assiste à des formes de violence ciblée, de lynchage notamment, et de ghettoisation. La violence conduit toujours à la ghettoisation. La violence fait que quand on est minoritaire, on quitte la poche que l'on habite pour rejoindre un quartier ou plus une ville qui est plus sûre. Démocratie ethnique. Mais démocratie quand même. Et c'est le troisième temps de cette séquence, enfin de cette rapide description. L'Inde reste une démocratie électorale. On vote tous les 5 ans pour le gouvernement central et puis dans chacun des États pour les gouvernements régionaux. Alors, on a gardé cette dimension que j'appelle démotique. Le démos continue à décider qui gouverne. Et ça va de pair avec le populisme. Le populiste ne peut être populaire que s'il a le mandat qui vient des urnes. Il lui faut passer devant les électeurs. Mais sans prendre trop de risques et sans prendre le risque de perdre surtout. Et donc vous avez ce que j'appelle un autoritarisme électoral au sens où la compétition est biaisée à 2 niveaux. Premièrement, l'argent, qui est tellement utile pour mener une campagne électorale, coule à flot du côté du parti majoritaire et se fait rare du côté de l'opposition. Un grand déséquilibre. En 2019, les estimations les plus fiables indiquaient que le parti du Premier ministre sortant, Narendra Modi, avait dépensé 3,5 milliards de dollars pour la campagne, ce qui est effectivement crédible lorsqu'on voit l'ampleur du dispositif mis en place. L'argent fait qu'on n'est pas sur un even playing field, comme on dit en anglais. La compétition n'est pas équitable. Deuxièmement, la couverture médiatique. Quand les médias sont de plus en plus la propriété d'oligarques amis du pouvoir, et Dieu sait si les télévisions passent les unes après les autres dans l'escarcelle de quelques hommes, alors la couverture d'une campagne électorale n'est pas équitable. Et on a un prime time qui est évidemment mobilisé par certains. Mais on vote quand même. Et je terminerai par un mot d'actualité, puisque tu l'as dit, Philippe, on rentre dans un cycle électoral en Inde, et il est très intéressant, ce cycle électoral. Tout comme Erdogan a failli perdre, ou en tout cas, pour la première fois, n'a pas gagné au premier tour, ce qui a déjà été un succès pour l'opposition turque. Et tout comme Netanyahou a perdu avant de regagner le pouvoir, on voit en Inde le même phénomène. Tous les partis d'opposition se mettent ensemble. C'est exactement ce qui s'est passé en Turquie, c'est exactement ce qui s'est passé en Israël. Face à un homme fort qui monopolise tellement le pouvoir, il faut tous se mettre ensemble parce que c'est existentiel. C'est la survie même de son parti qui est en cause. Et donc pour la première fois, depuis très longtemps, depuis 1977 en fait, tous les partis d'opposition ou presque ont formé une coalition qui, comme tu l'as dit, regroupe 28 partis et qui fait peur au pouvoir actuel, clairement. Il y a de la fébrilité du côté du pouvoir actuel. Alors pas seulement parce qu'il y a des élections générales au printemps prochain, mais parce qu'il y a des élections régionales dans plusieurs États très importants, 4 en particulier, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, Chhattisgarh et Telangana, dans quelques semaines, dans quelques mois, en décembre. Et il n'est pas impossible que ce soit à nouveau un moment difficile pour le BJP. Je dis à nouveau parce qu'au printemps dernier, le BJP a déjà perdu le Karnataka, qui était un État très important, avec Bangalore pour capitale, pour ceux qui ne connaissent pas les villes. Alors, on en est là. On est à un moment où, effectivement, en dépit de toutes les restrictions, de toutes les inégalités que j'ai citées, l'alternance est de l'ordre du possible. Simplement, et là c'est vraiment le mot de la fin, on a vu parfois les oppositions reprendre le pouvoir, mais ne pas réussir à faire marche arrière sur l'essentiel des transformations qui ont eu lieu. Et mon inquiétude, c'est que garder le pouvoir aujourd'hui, gagner et garder le pouvoir aujourd'hui ne sera pas suffisant pour ramener l'Inde au multiculturalisme d'antan, aux formes de liberté d'expression d'antan, parce que contrôler la rue, contrôler la société, c'est précisément une des choses que les nationalistes hindous font très bien et continueront sans doute de faire, même s'ils n'ont plus le pouvoir politique. Ça nous amène à la société. Quelle transition!
Thank you very much. So, Archana, let me turn to you now, and I hope you can react to some of the provocative comments made by Professor Jaffolo. But generally, I'd love to hear your views as somebody coming from India on the Indian society today. And going back to the analogy I was making earlier about the society of the word, which Professor Badi talked about this morning, India is the champion of NGOs, civil society, things like this. This is the impression that we have. Some of us will go to India not so frequently like myself. The impression is that the public opinion is very powerful and can actually play a big role in elections, but also there's a lot going on in India besides politics and even besides foreign policy, as we discussed at the beginning. So, turning to you.
I agree. I'll start with saying thank you for having me here, because it's wonderful to be listening to so many good ideas, and it's even more wonderful to see so many people, so many curious, intelligent people wanting to know more. So thank you very much. It's lovely to be here. And yes, what you're saying is absolutely right. India does have this kind of a culture. We've always been, there are books on it. There's a famous book called The Argumentative Indian. We like to give our opinions, we like to speak, we're people who like to be seen, like to be heard. And yes, to a certain extent, there is, I would agree with Christophe to certain things, that there seems to be a difficult time seemingly, but every government has its own way of working. And as an economic journalist, from what I have seen, it doesn't matter what you do, what policies you put in place. You have to make sure that unless people are comfortable, you're not going to get voted back to power. We've seen that in 2004, where we had a very powerful government, seemingly, again, a right-wing government that was there in power, seemingly well ensconced. But because people were not happy economically, that did affect. So that is a possibility. Having said that, where India is poised right now, the India story is at a very delicious turning. Whether it is societally or economically or geopolitically, it's at a very interesting turn. And I'm trained to look at things as opportunities and threats as a financial journalist. So I'll probably give you all like 3 things that I can see are working clearly, and which is why there is interest in hearing more about India. Right up front, we are the fastest growing major economy. There's no turning back from that at the moment. As things stand, we are managing through the pandemic also, in spite of all the social issues and problems that we had, the economy managed to grow. The geopolitical balancing act that India has been playing is showing results economically. One of the reasons why the balancing act is is so important, so crucial, is because India needs jobs. We are the youngest population in the world, and we need to create jobs for our youngsters, and we will be the world's we are already a big workforce for the world. We are a back office. Now we want to be the factory of the world. So yeah, there are ambitions of wanting to compete in the international market. There is a place that China is, seen as vacating or seeing there's a backslide when it comes to China and its position in the world supply chains. And India is poised at a very right place historically to be able to take at least some part of that, to compete for at least a part of those supply chains. So those are things that we are doing right. The demographic dividend, the fact that we are the world's second largest English-speaking nation after the US. So that works for us. We have more science graduates than anywhere else. That works for us. And we have 49% enrollment of women in higher studies. So those are the kind of figures that India is working with. That is where our opportunities lie. And we can take advantage of this. The biggest thing is that policy-wise, we're doing the right things for climate change. We've decided that, at least in terms of official direction, we're trying to ensure that we're relying more on renewables. We're ensuring that there is more a just transition for our people. These are the good parts of our story. But of course, there are always threats, like there are opportunities. And our demographic dividend window is really short. If we are not able to create jobs for our people by 2040, we are going to see more people, by 2040, there will be more people who are of retirement age than, more than 59 years old. And that is not a position that India can afford to be, given the inequalities in society, which is the other threat. We have incomes rising, but we have unequal rising of incomes. So there are some people who are becoming very rich and others who are not able to keep up. So that is a major, major threat. And as far as demographics, we were talking about demographics and societal issues. One of the biggest problems India has is that we're seeing women actually falling back in the workforce. In 2000, we had about 1/3 of Indian women of working age in jobs. That has fallen in the decade of 2010 to 2020. That has fallen the most. We're only 23% Indian women working at the moment. And at one point, it was worse than Saudi Arabia. So it's that kind of a gap that India needs to look at. If women come back to the workforce, it just immediately adds about 27 billion. If I'm not mistaken, that could be a wrong figure, but I remember reading about just how much more, by a third, India can increase its own GDP, but that hasn't happened. So that is a big gap that India needs to look at. Apart from, of course, the inequalities in society, which are, that a democracy needs to manage. So yes, we're poised at a very interesting place. Now it's a matter of which way things head.
Thanks a lot. I'll come back to you in a moment, but let me turn to Raja again. Here in Europe, the war in Ukraine is having a tremendous impact. I mean, even in this forum, many of the panels have been devoted to this issue. The role of China vis-à-vis Russia has been, it's gradually been analyzed, and critically analyzed, I would say. Could you tell us how Mr. Modi's government is dealing with specifically its relations with Russia, and how it is handling in terms of, I would say, public image, since we've been hearing all the good things that India is doing, and how it is projecting itself as a soft power, as a fairly powerful player worldwide, but how it is dealing specifically with this Russia-Ukraine issue. And perhaps, please feel free to comment a little bit on the foreign policy of Narendra Modi.
Yeah, just to take issue with Christophe. I mean, Christophe knows more about India than I do, because he tracks India's domestic politics closely. But I think the problem is Christophe has become a pessimist about India. He can take the current trends, extrapolate them into grand, significant conclusions. But I'm an optimist about India, its future, its political future, because we have to live in India. Because Christophe can bring an analytical clarity, because that doesn't make any difference to him. But I think in India, those of us who are citizens, I don't think we've given up hope. The assumption that somehow there is one leader who's driving us into a ditch, I think is fundamentally, really berates the agency of the Indian people. Mr. Modi is not, Xi Jinping. He can walk into a conference of, 3,000 people all dressed in dark suits, white shirt and blue tie, and raise hands to support him. I mean, he has to fight elections every day, and he's lost more elections in the provinces of India than he has won. That is one point. So I would say you've got to be patient. That brings me to the second point. Christophe compared India to, Turkey, various places, populism. But I think there is a problem for Europe, which says, look, you are here. All of us are in different degrees of Hades or hell down below. Don't compare India to Turkey. Compare India to European history of the last 100 years. Because Europe itself, is struggling still. You talked about Hungary, talk about Poland. The great transformation towards full democracies has not been done yet. So I think within India, there are massive struggles ahead. There's abuse of state power. There is need to take back control. A whole lot of issues. I'm sure the coming elections, you'll see a lot of those battles play out. But I think that Europe too has to see that you're not in a position to sit on judgment. That is by giving scorecards where you are, because this is a process of evolution of complex societies, of nation building that will have huge problems. Just as Europe in the last 100 years has had huge problems, we're going through that process, and I think some understanding, rather than this easy scorecards that are issued from different think tanks in Europe. Specifically on the foreign policy issue, look, I think India has made its choice. Christophe, so we made our choice. India is today, non-aligned India, thanks to Xi Jinping, is closer to the US and the West than ever before. That's a choice that has been made. We can say, look, unfortunately, the Congress party wouldn't make that choice, but Mr. Modi has made that choice. Partly because of the problems we have from China. The other aspect is that the West has chosen India. President Macron, President Bush, President Trump, that the West today, for its future in Asia, for its future as a leading power, leading collective in the world, it needs India. As much as India has decided, it needs a collaboration with the West to raise its own prosperity, to lift its own people up. That choice is a strategic choice that both sides have made. I know a lot of liberals are unhappy with these choices. They raise a lot of questions, but then, liberals don't always influence foreign policies. But my sense is we've really moved on. On the question of Ukraine, I'll just say one thing. Look, Russia is about India's past. It's not about India's future. Whatever the government might say, Russia's weight in India's trade is declining. Today, if we go back to 1990, our trade with Soviet Union was more than our trade with the United States. Today, our trade with the United States is $200 billion. The trade with Russia, if you take out the oil, which is a recent surge, is about $10 billion.
Okay, what about defense supplies?
Defense supplies, again, is a path dependence because of the past supply, because at that time the West was not willing to give us arms, that we were stuck with the Soviet Union. Today, I think Mr. Modi is inviting Western industries, including French capital, British capital, American capital, come invest in India, make weapons in India. That's the direction. In fact, France, Airbus, has just invested in a major plant to produce aircraft in India. That is the beginning. My sense is, in the longer term, the shared interest in a balance of power in Asia, we're going to see a lot more co-production deals. And my sense is, but this can't be done overnight. And finally, look, for us, the principal contradiction for India is today is the problem of China. And there, Russia is no longer an answer for us in dealing with that problem, because Russia has got closer to the Chinese. And in any way we calculate, the US, Europe, and Japan are partners in finding a balance in Asia. What do we do with Russia in the interim? We got to manage the problem. So Russia is a management problem for India. It's not the kind of political attachment that the Indian nationalists had for Russia in the last 100 years because of Soviet Union, national liberation, anti-imperialism. That phase is over. So for us to secure ourselves, both economically, politically, strategically, balancing China is the key, and there the West is our partner.
Okay, thank you. Back to Christophe. Just one word on Modi's visit to France in July. What was so significant about it? I mean, and any impact on the French-Indian relations? Are we important to India?
Certainly, but before responding, I would preface my response by returning to the formula Raja used. The West has chosen India, yes. The West is betting on India, investing in India to balance China. That is the number one threat. When the threat is so big, you rely on each and every balancing power you can find. And there is this different commitment. India has chosen the West. I'm not so sure. If India had chosen the West, it would have probably not abstained systematically in the UN on any Ukraine-related question. To choose means to take side. When you abstain, you don't take side. And if India had chosen the West, it would have also probably imposed sanctions on Russia the way all the allies and partners of the West have imposed sanctions on Russia. So there is a rapprochement. There is no doubt about that. The rapprochement is very significant, very rapid, in fact, very quick, compared to what it was when it started. It started in March 2000 when Bill Clinton visited India. And 23 years later, we can see the trajectory. But the point of no return is probably not yet there, and it makes a lot of sense. It's a long process. It will take a long time. And in any case, there is this legacy of non-alignment, which makes it always more complicated to become ally of anybody. India has partners, but it doesn't tie its hands with alliances. So that's a mindset in itself. Now, well, the French invest in India the way the US invest in India, and invest in both senses of the word, strategically, and of course, economically. And the subtext of the visit is arms deals. Who is in the driver's seat in most of the foreign policies of France today? The defense industry plays a big role. There is absolutely no doubt about that. And it's an interesting subtext. But there is a difference vis-à-vis the US. France tries not to antagonize China. And by the way, it's true of most of the Europeans. The Germans do the same. The EU at large does the same. You may remember the visit by Scholz in China last spring, just after Germany agreed to sell one terminal of Hamburg port to China. That's not something any American government would ever do. And you may also remember the visit, well, of Macron, very soon after, by the way, and this amazing interview he gave to Politico in the plane on the way back, saying, we are our strategic autonomy. We are not going to get involved in anything that the US may be doing in the South China Sea vis-à-vis Taiwan and so on. Well, that's an interesting distinction. You know, France is trying to appear as different, maybe because of the Gaullist legacy. We have our own strategic autonomy for sure. And that is something that explains partly the India-France rapprochement. India doesn't want a country that would be falling in line with any decision Washington, D.C. would make, because India is used to sanctions by the Americans. You know, 1998, after the nuclear test that India decided, sanctions were imposed by the US, by Japan, not by France, because we had tested 3 years before, so to impose sanctions on a country testing would have been a little bit of a bad test. But it's also a reflection of a different way, an independent way that India appreciates a lot, because India wants to diversify. You don't want to have your eggs in the same basket. Never forget that this is a country without a proper defense industry. Most of the equipment have to be imported. Jets, frigates, submarines. You need to diversify. $20 billion as an average is what India spends on weapons, on imports of weapons a year. To diversify is very important. France plays a big role there. So the visit was a way to reconfirm that, yes, France is not an ally, but a very strategic partner.
Archana, I want to go back to civil society, and especially one issue which you care a lot about, which is climate. Can India, which was a signatory to the Paris Climate Accord in 2015, be a leader and take all its place in the fight against climate change? Is this an issue versus productivity, which is actually a big problem in many countries, including China, which Christophe just mentioned, where officials are being told, you have to be productive. At the same time, they are told, you have to be careful with the environment. Is there this kind of debate in India, and how does the society react to this massive issue which all of us are facing?
See, one of the advantages that we have in India is that there is no climate denial on any level. We are amongst the countries that will be the worst hit, that are already amongst the worst hit by climate change. There's no doubt about that. We're already facing heat waves of a scale that we've never seen before in history. So every month we're writing stories about 122 years, the highest temperatures in 122 years, the most rain in 100 odd years. So we're already there, and the government seems cognizant of that. as far as leadership is concerned, I think the G20 would be a good example of seeing how things worked out there. Because whether or not anything else came out of that, one of the things that did come out was that the communique agreed on, for the first time, numbers of the kind of funds that the Global South will require to fight climate change. For the first time, we went from billions to trillions. So far, there was this vague promise that the rich nations had made of giving the Global South $100 billion to be able to mitigate some of the climate change problems. And that, not a penny has come so far. But the talk has always been about, how much the Global South will require in terms of mitigating, adapting the losses and damages that they're facing. For instance, Pakistan had $30 billion worth of losses when they were hit by floods last year. So who pays for that? And I think the first time the communique actually spoke about the need that $5.9 trillion will be required, till 2030. You will require $4 trillion every year for transition. So that kind of clarity has come, and that will hopefully be part of the COP debate when the countries meet for the COP in November. So India has managed to do that. There's clarity in terms of what they want. For instance, when Mr. Modi spoke in 2021, and he committed to the 2070 goal that was announced, he stepped up and said, we will need $1 trillion. So that clarity is there, but at the same time, there is also action in terms of policy where they're trying to raise those funds internally. They're not really relying on loans, they're not looking at grants, but they're looking at changing policy in such a way that it becomes more profitable. PLIs, like they're doing PLIs for manufacturing, they're actually looking at policy that can help this industry come in. So in that sense, India is doing something right there.
Okay, I've noticed you said G20 is serving a purpose for climate, and
I do
my
believe
neighbor to my left is saying this is the end of G20. So
I disagree with him on that.
Okay, good. One word on this, or before we turn to the audience.
Look, I think the solutions, as I said, are not going to come from multilateral forums. The thing was to hang it together, keep it together, rather than, look, the promises made in multilateral forums are like checks in the mail. Rarely get to see them. I mean, if you look at all the promises that were made about climate finance in the last 20 years, nothing has much come. You have European countries walking back on the commitments made. Britain is walking back. If you listen to Republican debate last night, you won't sleep. So look, I think the idea is, I think is finally the answer. I think I agree with Republicans in one level. You've got to produce new technologies that alter the energy economic equation. That can only come through technology. And I think there, the partnership between India and the West, India, France, India, US, is where I think we got to find new ways of producing energy that would, reduce the climate change and other effects. But I just wanted to add one final thing. I mean, my sense is, it is not, one is the immediate balance of power requirements that today have brought India and the West together. But I think the larger sense looking ahead, the demographic decline in the West, the need for talent from India, and the need to produce a structure of international governance where you need to accommodate, because the West in itself, its relative weight in the international system is going down. And you are challenged by states like Russia and China. You need to bring in, you need to accommodate some friendly powers. I think that was the idea of making G7 into G10, bringing India, South Korea, and Australia. So I think some form of a historic accommodation, which I think is what we are discussing today, and I fully agree with Christophe that India is not going to be a Britain to the United States. India is not going to be even a France to the United States, because France is part of NATO. We're not going to be part of any alliance. But I think it is the question of working out some terms of mutually acceptable engagement between India and the West that I think are critical for managing the global economy, for global climate, and I think that is where the possibilities for India's relationship with the West exist. But there will be a huge number of problems. we see every day there's one new problem. But I think this is the trajectory that India and the West today are on. And I think that's where we got to keep the eyes on, even while we see them managing the near-term problems.
Est-ce qu'il y aurait des questions en français ou en anglais? Donc, il y a des micros. Il y a un micro qui va arriver. Vous allez commencer, monsieur. Si vous pouvez juste vous présenter. Allez-y.
Namaste, Mehanam Shalihe. First of all, thank you for your presence here in Normandy. I'm Charlie, international counselor. I work in India for several years and still attached to this wonderful country by marriage. India, can I put just a context, sorry for my question? It's okay? Yeah.
A quick question would be better than a long speech. But
okay, so India is clearly now a worldwide economic player. France government is really involved building partnership in India. French companies have clearly interest to develop their business and their workers, like Airbus with Indigo, Dassault with Rafales. My question is finally, on one side, India is welcoming France for business opportunities with foreigners workers. Nevertheless, France is clearly not playing equal by welcoming Indian workers in France. No any recognition of diplomas. What do you think about this one-way situation that I personally feel unfair?
Okay, anybody wants to comment on this? Chris, I mean, this is, I don't feel very competent. Do you want to say a word?
You're saying, is France discriminating against bringing in?
Yes, I'm not aware of this, but...
Look, I think we got to, as an Indian, I mean, I fully understand. There are problems with immigration that everywhere in every society. In fact, I would say the West was open from the mid-60s to take people from outside. And that has produced a massive, migrations from the West into Europe and the West as a whole. And the challenge today, I think, is to reach a level of understanding where we agree on talent-based immigration because your industry needs talent. Your industry needs technical manpower. Therefore, can we ensure technical skill migration that your societies need while preventing illegal migration or the migration that you don't want? I think that is the compromise formula that we have to negotiate because I think it's in our own interests, both our interests, to have some understanding because the problem is only going to get worse. I know the European debates on immigration, what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening across the Mediterranean, and if climate change actually begins to produce refugees, we're in a different world. So my sense is we need a new compact between India and the West on how to deal with the challenges of migration. And there I think it's possible to work out mutually beneficial solutions rather than saying open the doors for everyone or the sense that we are somehow entitled to come into Europe and to live here.
And I can tell you there are many Indian students in French universities and engineering colleges and business schools, and they can certainly stay in France if their skills are suitable to companies just like anybody else. But
problem with a lack of nurse, lack of doctors, dentists. Right. There is some talents in India and can't come to France because they are not recognized in France. Okay. So for me, it's a little bit easy way for France to make business in India.
Immigration is a big issue, and I'm sure Indians are more than welcome if they meet certain criteria. But obviously, it's like with any country, India has to follow some rules.
Thank you.
Philippe, just a quick word on this. It's a very important problem, not only for France and India relations, but the EU-India relations, because it's a European question. And when the free trade agreement that is under discussion will reach that point, it will be a bone of contention. When the FTA negotiations failed in 2013, it was partly on this. We don't want immigrants in Europe. This is a huge problem. It's a political assessment of the situation.
You don't want them, you can't do without them. So I think
exactly. Well, the Germans have understood that. Germany has understood that. Yeah. Most of the other countries, UK is not in the EU anymore. but in the EU today, you have very few countries who have understood that we need migrants because politically it is so sensitive that they prefer to keep the door closed. And that's really self-defeating.
Having said that, I'm really happy that there are people who are so aware and willing to speak up. So we do have friends here. Thank you.
He hasn't been sent by the Indian embassy, I can testify. I don't know him.
Let's get more questions.
D'autres questions?
Other questions?
Monsieur, oui.
Merci. Je peux la faire en français, parce qu'il y a un terme que je maîtrise pas en anglais. Bonjour, merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much.
Qu'en est-il du fameux collier de perles dont on parlait à un moment, et est-ce que vous pouvez, donc, dans la Chine qui essaie de contenir un peu l'Inde par le sud, est-ce qu'on peut revenir aussi sur les points de contention au nord, au niveau de quels sont les points d'accrochage entre les deux pays, s'il vous plaît?
Issues in the north between the two countries, between China and India.
Look, I think we used to think historically the problem was in the north and the Himalayas, which is what he's referring to. A dispute that goes back to when India and China both became independent countries. But 75 years later, we still don't have a solution. Unfortunately, what's happened in the last decade is the contestation has increased in the Himalayas. Because Chinese PLA has modernized, has built infrastructure in Tibet. India is now doing the same. So there is actually a growing, the disputation has actually increased. What we've seen is there are no answers clearly. The Chinese believe they're simply claiming what is theirs. Whether in South China Sea, whether it's East China Sea, whether it's the Himalayas, the sense that China is more powerful than its neighbors and its moment to redeem what it thinks are legitimate territorial claims. And I think that's one reason why you have the countervailing coalitions. So without the four crises in the Himalayas, 2013, 2014, 2017, and 2020, I doubt if India would have moved so close to the US as it has. But I think there it is. We are locked in that situation. Because your problem in the north does not mean the maritime problem doesn't exist. And there we see we're actually, that too will grow because, all great economies, all great trading nations, but also great naval powers. That's what European history tells us. A China that is rising will inevitably come to the Indian Ocean. And that is going to lead to competition. And I think the question is, there we're working with France as well in the Western Indian Ocean. We're working with the US across the Indo-Pacific. So my sense is there, it again will produce more collaboration between India and the maritime powers of the West. But we're not in the business of containing China because China is too big to be contained. What we're talking about is balance, stability, deterrence.
But something we need to say is the G20 was instrumental in putting together an agreement between India, Global Gateway, which is the EU's response to the Belt and Road Initiative, and some countries in the Middle East. So it's, perhaps we can say a word about the Belt and Road Initiative and how to deal with it from an Indian point of view?
Yeah, briefly. I think earlier Christophe said, look, India abstains on issues relating to Russia. That is true. But we don't abstain on issues relating to China. India was one of the first countries to criticize the Belt and Road Initiative. And today, finally, we're really happy that Europe has joined India and the US in building this new corridor. That was not a G20 result. That was on the margins of the G20, where President Macron, President Biden, the EU leadership, India, the Saudi leadership, and the UAE leadership came together to say, let's restore this historic connectivity between the subcontinent and Europe. And I think that's just the beginning, because Europe has the money in the Global Gateway project. The US doesn't bring money, as you know. They're good at taking people around.
From Europe, it's the same old money, dare I say. It's not new money.
But still, Global Gateway has a lot of money promised, but at least the state can drive the money. The US, the markets have to give the money. But UAE and Saudis are very rich. So I think we're at a interesting moment where we can think of restoring. And I think I'll just conclude here with I think we're also restoring the historic connectivity between Europe and Asia. I think that is the new situation that is emerging. A Europe that turned inward towards its own integration, and India that turned inwards. Today, I think, working together, we can restore many of the historic connectivities, overland connectivities, and maritime connectivities. This, I think, could be the beginning of a new way the geographies are going to connect with each other.
Just a footnote to this, because it's indeed very interesting to see how there is an attempt at emulate the BRI, the the Belt and Road Initiative by doing something similar with India, the West, build a better back, build back a better word, B3W is also part of it. And it fits in my idea that there is a growing polarization, because we duplicate the BRI doing something different, and India is on that side, clearly. And indeed, France is even more interested than most of the countries there, because we have the La Réunion Island, we have Mayotte, we have 1 million people in the Indian Ocean, and feeling the heat, feeling the Chinese expansion the same way. China is there in Sri Lanka with some military, potentially military equipment. It's there also in the Maldives, potentially. Well, this is part of what France calls its special economic zone. So we have indeed a new scenario. Once upon a time, India was very much asking for the West to leave it alone in its Mare Nostrum, Indian Ocean. You know, Diego Garcia was a bone of contention, no foreigner there. Now it's the contrary. You're more than welcome. Help us to contain China, or at least to resist to Chinese influence, without alienating China. And this is very tricky, because you depend so much on China for so many things that you can't break the relationship. At the same time, you want to resist this expansion. That's a tricky equilibrium.
Just, I think, one small thing with your permission. I mean, I think you're being unfair to Europe and to France. We're not imitating China. Who built the Suez Canal? I believe it was a French idea. Nothing has changed the global geography like the Suez Canal did. China is nowhere near doing anything as spectacular as the Suez Canal. If you look at our cities in Asia, Bombay, Calcutta, Madras, Hong Kong, Shanghai, these are all built by Western capital. Pondicherry and the French, that was small, but it was the Western capital that built modern Asia. So I think Chinese were trying to imitate this by saying they can do similar grand projects, but I think within a decade is exactly a year now. Many of the problems with that model are coming to the fore. So, but I think what the West is doing is really returning to its own capacities to actually think more grandly about infrastructure projects. And I think my sense is that's where the partnership with India, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE could actually open up new possibilities.
Right, it's about time, because the Suez Canal has actually been enlarged by China, and China is the country that's actually put more money on the table for infrastructure, and still. So it's about time the others wake up. Archana, do you have to add anything?
I just want to bring it back to our topic of, so this is where we are. I mean, the fact that this increasing competition and this space that is being created by the distrust or mistrust towards China, this whole build back better and building resilient supply chains that are reliable and being able to partner someone. That is where I think Rajmohan is right in saying that India has already made that choice. And when India, at least my view, when India says that we're going to partner with everybody, we're not going to take sides, they're basically trying to say, hey, you can trust us, all of us can. And the G20 communique was one way of showing that. But it's a tough balancing act. And that is why I say that we are at a very delicious turn. If we manage to do this, then economically, India has a chance to become an even bigger partner to the world. And so, no wonder we are discussing this here today.
D'autres questions? En français, en anglais.
More questions in French or in English?
Madame.
Namasté, namaskar.
Namasté, namaskar.
Pour revenir au niveau humain, on est inquiet de voir aux nouvelles que les musulmans sont persécutés en Inde.
One is concerned to see that Muslims are being persecuted in
Et un
India.
deuxième
What do you
point,
think about that?
Quel est l'avenir des peuples du nord-est de l'Inde, comme les Mizo et les Nagas, qui ont leur propre culture et qui tiennent à leur autonomie. Quand on suit les nouvelles, on voit que quand on n'est pas hindou, on est musulman ou même chrétien, enfin les musulmans particulièrement sont persécutés violemment. C'est ma première question. Sinon, ma deuxième question concerne les peuples du nord-est de l'Inde, Naga, Mizo, qui ont leur propre culture, qui sont très attachés et qui tiennent à leur autonomie, et pourtant qui sont harassés par l'armée indienne.
Je peux répéter ce que j'ai dit, mais ce ne serait pas très intéressant. Donc, je vais plutôt changer d'angle. On peut dire que la construction nationale, dans la plupart des pays, implique la disparition du multiculturalisme. On peut considérer que construire une nation, ça veut dire imposer la culture du groupe dominant. C'est comme ça que beaucoup de nations, y compris la nôtre d'ailleurs, se sont construites. Effectivement, on a petit à petit fait le ménage, entre guillemets, et dans nos annales, il y a un épisode particulièrement sanglant que l'on passe souvent sous silence. C'est ce qu'on appelle le génocide vendéen. Bon, le mot est peut-être un peu fort, mais il existe. Et on peut considérer que ça fait partie de la trajectoire normale, naturelle, inévitable du nation building. Et puis on peut se dire que il y a aussi un respect de la diversité qui doit être partie prenante de la construction nationale, et que dans un pays aussi vaste, la diversité culturelle elle est inévitable et elle doit être reconnue. De fait, c'est un pays fédéral qui a calé son fédéralisme sur des critères ethno-linguistiques, puisque chaque État ou presque parle sa langue. Et aujourd'hui, on voit un centralisme, une centralisation qui va de pair avec ce majoritarisme qui transforme les minorités en citoyens de seconde zone. Alors, ça c'est l'image globale. Maintenant, vous posez une question plus spécifique concernant le Nord-Est, qui est effectivement particulièrement varié, puisque vous avez 7 petites entités politiques à la frontière de la Chine et de la Birmanie, qui sont chaque fois elles-mêmes diverses et plurielles. Et aujourd'hui, il y en a une, le Manipur, qui est à feu et à sang depuis juin dernier, dont on parle très peu, mais qui est le reflet de ce majoritarisme appliqué cette fois-ci alors aux chrétiens. Alors, ça a des implications, internationales, parce que cette zone est quand même celle par laquelle l'Inde peut se relier à l'Asie du Sud-Est, à la Birmanie, à la Thaïlande, et Dieu sait s'il y a des projets de connectivité internationaux dans la zone. Finalement, ne pas prendre la mesure des risques de déstabilisation intérieure que le majoritarisme implique, c'est aussi se priver de ressources internationales dans une zone comme celle-ci. Et il faut espérer que ce sera la raison pour laquelle on va finir par, en quelque sorte, revenir à la normale. Pour l'instant, ça va faire 6 mois maintenant. Et encore hier, il y a eu plusieurs centaines de morts, plus d'une centaine de morts. On est dans une situation de quasi-guerre civile, en vérité, dans cette zone assez reculée, assez inaccessible, et donc d'une couverture médiatique difficile.
Any comments on this? Or,
I think just on the Northeast issue, I think it's actually, if you see the Chinese Yunnan province, India's Northeast, and Burma's northern provinces. These were regions where actually enormous autonomous tribal communities lived without any contact with modernity. But the Qing expansion into southern China, the British colonial expansion into Assam and beyond, and the occupation of Burma, produced over the last 100 years a series of violent conflicts today, conditions for violent conflict between the plains people and the hills people. between different religious groups, between the Buddhists and non-Buddhists, between different tribal groups. So this is actually a gigantic churn that is unfolding in this part of the world. Is India managing that responsibly? I think India has had some successes over the last 75 years of integrating some of them, creating statehood, provinces within there. But as development comes in, the conflict over land, over resources, over migration, you're talking about European migration, internal migration within India and within the Northeast, those are at the source of conflict. This again, I think, if we go beyond the headlines, I think the struggle of extending modern state into northern Burma, into China, of course China controls it effectively, and in Indian Northeast today is a challenge that is there with us. And similarly, if you go to Pakistan frontier, in Afghanistan, in the Balochistan, across the Himalayas, every single area around which had tribal populations, and where modern state under colonialism tried to penetrate, the legacies of those issues are still with us. So it's a great tragedy how ordinary people are suffering because of this. That expanding modern state into these domains, imposing modern forms of governance, imposing modern rules, I think has set off unprecedented conflict from the Bay of Bengal, from the Baloch to northern Burma. That there are these real conflicts, and I think that the question is, how do we manage this? And I think we really need to measure up for our own good, not to impress the rest of the world. And I think the task is enormously huge, both for Burma, for India, for China, as well as for Pakistan and Iran.
And Burma is a country that is currently ruled by a military dictatorship, itself facing conflicts internal from ethnic groups, from dissidents. It's also certainly not in a good state of governance. But d'autres questions?
Other questions?
Oui.
Du fait de l'encerclement par la Chine, du fait de l'encerclement de l'Inde par la Chine, l'Inde développe-t-elle une stratégie équivalente qui répond au collier de perles?
Respond to that strategy of the pearl necklace?
As we said, look, if Portugal could establish bases in India, we're back talking about this 15th century, 16th century, a rising number 2 economy, and navies can't be simply projected without bases. So China has got the first base in Djibouti. They're looking for another couple on East African coast, probably in the Gulf. In Cambodia, they're building another base. So I think Chinese military presence is a reality. It will only get more and more accurate, more acute in the coming years. So I think the answer to that is that India and the Western maritime powers are coming together to find ways to deal with it, of actually greater maritime collaboration. And meanwhile, the European powers have had bases. France has its own. You have your own territories as well, Reunion Island. You have other places in the Pacific on the other side. Britain has Diego Garcia, the Americans sit there. France has a base in United Arab Emirates. So we are doing more closely, we're working more closely with France, with the United States, to create a strategy where a Chinese naval presence, I think they have interest. You can't deny them their right to do exactly what former colonial powers have done, or modern European powers do. The question is then, how do we balance this out? Rather than saying, look, China has no right to come in, they will come, whether you object to it or not, because they have so much of stakes in Africa. They depend so much on mineral resources of Africa, energy resources of the Middle East. So I think the question is, we had Anglo-American rivalries in the past on managing the competing military bases. Today, I think some form of competition. But today, are we wiser 400 years later to do this more, pragmatically, rather than leading to a serious conflict? And I think that is the question.
Archana, I just wonder, from your point of view, in India, do really people care about the rise of India, the containment of China, foreign policy issues, allying with the West, or counter the West, or counter China? Is this something in people's daily lives, as opposed to the civil society issues which you care about a lot. Which is this on top of the list?
I think we should look at social media for that answer. And if you see, Mr. Jaishankar is, I think, a very popularly watched minister in this particular government. The thing is that the story, China is central to most discussions, because whether it is economics, whether it is security, whether it is India's place, socially, every discussion, there is China. And ever since May 2020, when China appeared at our borders, this discussion has only widened. So to answer your question, yes, it is a big part of discussions, and it matters to an average Indian how we are managing this, which is why the story is told, and which is why there is conversation about this, because one of the most important jobs in India is the army. Army is one of the biggest recruiters. So to ordinary Indians, it matters what's happening at our borders, and it matters what's happening in the economic competition. So.
And does it matter if India is a superpower or not to people?
I think that is a story that increasingly is taking hold in a country which is as young as India, because in our universities and in our schools and in our colleges, these are discussions that are happening. I am aware that people that the youngsters are engaging with this idea, and they are a very confident generation, as you can see from some of the people I met, some of the Indians I met when I flew down. It was very obvious. This is a confident generation, it's a curious generation, and it is a generation that is very connected. So yes.
Il y avait une question au fond.
There was a question at the back. Yes.
Oui, merci pour ce débat, ces échanges. Je voulais savoir comment, suite au conflit entre la Russie et l'Ukraine, il y a des échanges assez importants de pétrole entre la Russie et l'Inde. Et est-ce que l'Inde a envie de diminuer ces échanges pour faire un peu plus pression, aider l'Occident à faire pression sur la Russie?
It's for you.
I was told we were actually helping the West by buying Russian oil. Because the argument is that the Americans have said this publicly, that if you did not let the Russian oil come into the market completely, everyone will turn to Northern Europe, where what you can get, or to the Middle East, which is where most of the oil is being produced. If all of us were only trying to source from the Middle East, the price of the oil would have gone up. So in fact, the American emphasis was on a price cap rather than saying don't buy any Russian oil. So I think that's where, in some senses, it is the idea that, look, in India that takes some of the Russian oil, reduces the pressure on the global oil market. Look, but I think what we've seen, look, in Europe itself, Hungary gets a carve out. Europe, also make sure that, look, in the name of sanctioning, you don't hurt yourself. And I think the balancing in any sanctions process is because sanctions always involve hurting yourself. The question is, are you imposing more pain on the other guy while taking some pain yourself? That's always the trade-off in sanctions. And I think the oil thing, the way it has worked out, is really trying to find a balance. That's why the price cap was a solution. Europe still buys gas, right? You can't stop the gas. We used to buy mostly from the Middle East, so we have next door, that's what we would have done. But I think the way the market has played out, I think Europe is not in a position to totally cut off Russian energy, and I think that's where you are. And I think Europe has done a great job reducing it significantly, but as we come to the second winter, I think the problems are going to get worse, and the Saudi-Russian collaboration is raising the prices. So I think we're still there. The oil challenge will be with us, but not exactly in the form that what you said. That's one part of the problem.
But certainly, if India continues to trade with Russia, that's not sending good signals to the US, to Europeans.
But I said Europe is trading with Russia in gas. So I'm not scoring a point. Look, you can't pull out the pipelines, right, overnight. You cut off oil significantly. That's a very impressive achievement. You can't pull out the gas pipelines. So I think that's where the price cap as a way of what is the objective of cutting off Russian oil and hydrocarbons was to reduce the revenues that Russia was going to get through continuing export of oil. The price cap was a means to do that. And I think the US government has not criticized India on this. Actually, it's saying, look, what India is doing is really partly to help keep the prices low. But meanwhile, the Russians and the Saudis are collaborating. Even yesterday, the oil prices are going to go up. So I think the need to manage this oil market, again, we need to find ways of working together rather than simply saying, look, show me your loyalty, why are you doing this kind of thing. But I think the US government, at least, has been quite sensitive in terms of understanding this. And even the Europeans, barring the Western commentaries in the media, I think there is sufficient understanding between Indian and the Western governments that how to deal with this problem.
Any concluding words from Christophe, from Archana, before we leave this room?
Well, only one addition, because we have not mentioned that at all. The political economy of India is changing these days, and it's a very interesting development that we are seeing. The rise of a kind of oligarchy with very few entrepreneurs controlling large sectors of the economy. That was not like that ever, never ever before in India. And that's another challenge. The rise of Gautam Adani, for instance, is just meteoric, unprecedented. Some people compare him to Dhirubhai Ambani, but there is no comparison really. When you look at the quality and the quantity of what he is controlling. How this political economy will influence foreign policy is an interesting dimension. Mr. Adani is having coal mines in Australia, ports in Haifa. It's interesting to see how the government and actors of the private sector are certainly in a kind of joint venture. So when we look at foreign policy of India today, we need to factor in this kind of variable, and that's rather new. We need to factor in another variable, the diaspora. We have not mentioned it at all, except via migrants and migration. But what is going on in Canada, in the US, in UK, in Australia, has something to do with this other very important and new connection between the government of India and communities, Indian communities in these different countries. So it shows that the world is changing in many different ways. And when we look at foreign affairs, we need to look at the articulation between the domestic and the international, not only officially, not only with institutions, but also with transnational actors, businessmen on the one end, diasporas on the other end.
I think this is very much the theme of this conference, but yes. Raja wants to have a final word.
No. Look, I think capitalism is not built by saints. And we become good students of the West on how to treat your capitalists, because historically, independent India under Nehruvian socialism kept the capitalists completely away from foreign policy. But today, when we know that if there is a deal between Lockheed and Rafale, both the presidents will call Prime Minister of India, saying, please take our thing, because I got 50,000 jobs riding on this. So I think we similarly today, I think what India is doing, finally using its capitalists to promote the interests. And I think this is not a shocking, this is really the tradition. We're beginning to learn that. I think we've been good students of the West.
Archana, you have the final word.
Thank you. So all I have to say is, in parts, I agree in the fact that while I see that India, again, I reiterate that India is at a very interesting position economically, politically, geopolitically. But one of the things for 2024, because that is what we've started this discussion with, is yes, it will be interesting to watch the impact, at least for me as a journalist, to see what the impact of the discussions in public on the oligarchs or in terms of what has been happening with women in Northeast and how India treats its people, its minorities and its women is going to be an interesting question to watch 2024. And those are the risks. But I think at the moment, the opportunities far outweigh those risks, at least from where I'm standing. And hopefully, we'll be able to come back here again and discuss in a few years what India did right. So that's all I have to say.
Merci. Rendez-vous l'année prochaine. Rendez-vous l'année prochaine pour commenter les élections indiennes et le rôle de l'Inde dans le monde. Merci à tous.